Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the dark, beating heart of early medieval England, a story of how a nation was violently broken, and how a completely new world was built from its shattered pieces. What if I told you that the foundation of the modern world wasn't built on noble ideals, but forged in the fiery chaos of a burning church on Christmas Day, driven by panic, greed, and a terrified king trembling before the altar? And before we dive in, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you right now? What city? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories always make my night. It is Christmas Day. You are standing in the freezing winter air outside Westminster Abbey. Inside that massive stone structure is William, the Duke of Normandy, the man history will soon call the Conqueror. He has already won the Battle of Hastings. He has seen the English King Harold fall with an arrow in his eye. He has marched on London, and the city has finally surrendered. Today is supposed to be his ultimate triumph, his coronation, but there is no joy in the crisp winter air, only tension. Thick, suffocating tension. William is surrounded by his Norman knights. They are foreign invaders in a strange cold land, and they are severely outnumbered. Imagine the psychology of this moment. You are one of perhaps 10,000 Normans. All around you are 1 to 2 million Anglo-Saxons, and they hate you. Suddenly, a massive sound erupts from inside the abbey. It is a shout, a deafening roar of voices. Inside, the bishop has just asked the congregation in both English and French if they accept William as their king. The people shout their approval. It is a tradition, a standard ritual, but the Norman guards stationed outside don't understand English traditions. They don't speak the language. When they hear the massive roar echoing from the ancient stone walls, their blood runs cold. They think it's an ambush. They think the English have trapped their duke inside and are slaughtering him. Panic takes over, and panic, in the Middle Ages, is a very dangerous thing. The Norman guards react the only way they know how, with sudden, overwhelming violence. They draw their swords. They start setting fire to the wooden houses surrounding the abbey. Flames lick the winter sky. Black smoke billows into the air, blocking out the sun. Inside the abbey, the acrid smell of smoke drifts in. The sound of screaming outside drowns out the holy chants. The congregation panics. People rush for the heavy wooden doors, trampling each other in a desperate bid to escape the fire. Some run to save their homes. Others, seizing the chaos of the moment, begin to loot the burning buildings. Within minutes, the grand, packed abbey is almost entirely empty. Only a few people remain near the altar. A handful of monks, a few shivering bishops, and William, the great conqueror, the fearsome warlord who crossed the sea. A Norman monk who wrote about this day half a century later tells us a striking detail. As the smoke filled the vaulted ceilings and the screams echoed from the burning streets, William was trembling. He was shaking violently. Yet, he forced the bishops to finish the ceremony. In a dark, nearly empty, smoke-filled church, surrounded by the crackle of burning homes and the cries of the terrified public, the heavy crown was placed on his head. It was a terrifying start, a traumatic birth of a new regime. William was now King of England. But the conquest was far from over. In many ways, the nightmare had just begun. For the next 5 years, William could not sleep soundly. He had every reason to be paranoid. Every single year, from 1067 to 1070, violent rebellions erupted in Kent, in the southwest, on the Welsh borders, in the Fens, and a massive, bloody uprising in the north. The Normans lived like an occupying army, because that is exactly what they were. They didn't blend in. They couldn't. They lived together, ate together, slept together in heavily armed encampments, always watching their backs, always sleeping with one eye open. And to survive, they began to build. They built structures that the English had never seen before on such a terrifying scale. Castles. First, they were great mounds of earth topped with wooden fortresses. Soon, they were replaced by cold, imposing stone walls. These castles weren't just military bases. They were psychological weapons. They were the physical manifestation of foreign dominance. A constant, looming shadow reminding the millions of English that they were being watched, that they were subjects in their own land. You have to understand the sheer catastrophe this was for the defeated people. It wasn't just a change of management at the top. It was the complete, systematic erasure of an entire culture's elite. By the time William ordered the massive nationwide survey, known as the Domesday Book in 1086, the English landscape had been completely rewritten. The Domesday Book was so thorough, so invasive, that the English people compared it to the Last Judgment. The king's commissioners wanted to know every plough, every pig, every slave you owned. And the statistics they recorded are chilling. In 1086, only 2 major English nobles had survived the purges and kept their status. Just 2. Over 4,000 Anglo-Saxon Thegans, the traditional wealthy landowning elite who had ruled for centuries, were stripped of their ancestral lands. And who replaced them? Less than 200 Norman barons. Imagine that sudden transfer of wealth. A whole nation's elite wiped out, replaced by a tiny, ultra-rich foreign cartel. In the church, it was the exact same story. In 1070, William systematically removed the English bishops. After that, he never appointed another Englishman to be a bishop or an abbot. The spiritual leaders of the country were now foreigners. The trauma went far deeper than just losing land or titles. In the winter of 1069 to 1070, William marched north to crush a rebellion. He didn't just defeat the rebel army, he punished the earth itself. He burned the crops, he slaughtered the livestock, he destroyed the farming tools. He engineered a man-made famine so severe that people resorted to eating dogs, horses, and even human flesh just to survive. Records show that between 1066 and 1086, the value of land in Yorkshire dropped by a staggering 2/3. It was a wasteland. The old world was gone. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy ceased to exist, and a new cross-channel elite took their place. These men owned vast, stolen estates in England, but they also kept their rich lands back in Normandy. England and Normandy were no longer separate worlds. They were bound together by a unified Anglo-Norman ruling class. For the next century and a half, the politics of England became completely entangled with the politics of France, because the Duke of Normandy, who was now the King of England, still owed his allegiance to the French king. And these new masters brought their culture with them. They brought their architecture, the grand, heavy Romanesque cathedrals that soared arrogantly above the simple English churches. But most importantly, they brought their language. French became the language of power, the language of the royal court, the language of the law, the language of money and estate management. If you wanted to be anyone, if you wanted to be considered educated or civilized, you had to speak and write in French. For generations, an educated person in England lived in 3 distinct linguistic worlds. English was the language of the hearth, the language of the dirt, the mother tongue of the conquered and the poor. Latin was the language of God, the scribes, and the church. And French was the language of the masters. England, for all intents and purposes, became a French colony. Not a colony owned by the French king, but a colony of French culture and Norman ambition. It is no wonder that generations of English patriots looked back at the Battle of Hastings as the ultimate national tragedy. It was arguably the greatest disaster in English history. Not just because it was violent, all medieval conquests are violent, but because the events of 1066 didn't just defeat an army, they buried a civilization. The English were strangers in their own home, an oppressed majority, staring up at the cold stone walls of Norman castles, listening to their lords speak a language they could not understand. But this new, brutal elite was about to face its own nightmares, because holding onto a stolen kingdom is a lot harder than taking it, and the bloodline of the Conqueror was about to experience a sudden tragedy that would plunge this New England into pure, unadulterated anarchy. The great Conqueror did not have a peaceful end. For a man who had reshaped a nation with fire and sword, his final moments were remarkably undignified. In September of the year 1087, William suffered a fatal injury while riding his horse during a military campaign in France. He had grown incredibly heavy in his later years, so heavy in fact that when his attendants tried to force his lifeless body into a stone sarcophagus in the church at Caen, his bloated corpse literally burst open. A horrific smell filled the cathedral. The mourners were sickened. It was a tragic, almost poetic end for a man who had swallowed so much of the world. He was dead, and his vast, newly forged empire was immediately split in 2. His eldest son, Robert, inherited the traditional homeland of Normandy, but the grand prize, the conquered kingdom of England, was handed to his second son, William Rufus. History remembers him as the Red King. William Rufus was a fiercely capable warlord, but he was not a beloved king. To the English monks who wrote the histories of the time, Rufus was a walking scandal. He surrounded himself with a court of extravagance and pleasure. He never married. He had no children, no heir to secure the fragile new dynasty. He treated the church not as a holy institution but as a piggy bank, keeping bishoprics empty for years just so he could funnel their massive incomes directly into his own pockets. He was powerful, arrogant, and seemingly untouchable. One chronicler wrote that the wind and the sea themselves seemed to obey him, but power in the Middle Ages is a shadow. It can vanish in the blink of an eye. It happened in the height of summer. August the 2nd, the year 1100. The Red King was hunting in the New Forest. It was a vast, ancient woodland in southern England, a place of deep shadows and sudden silences. Rufus was an experienced hunter, but on this particular afternoon something went terribly wrong. An arrow flew through the dense trees. It did not hit a stag. It struck the King of England directly in the chest. William Rufus collapsed into the dirt, bleeding out on the forest floor. He died almost instantly. Was it an accident? A stray shot from a clumsy nobleman? Or was it an assassination? We will never know the absolute truth, but history leaves us with a very suspicious clue. Hunting with the king that day was his younger brother, Henry. When Henry saw his brother fall dead, he did not rush to his side to mourn. He did not order a grand funeral procession. He didn't even wait to bring the body out of the woods. Henry turned his horse around and rode as fast as he could to the city of Winchester. Winchester was where the royal treasury was kept. He seized the silver, he seized the gold. With the kingdom's wealth locked firmly in his hands, he immediately rode to Westminster. Just 3 days after his brother died in the dirt of the New Forest, Henry was crowned King of England. It was a breathtakingly fast coup, and Henry knew his position was incredibly unstable. His older brother Robert, the Duke of Normandy, was returning from the Crusades, covered in glory, and eager to claim the English throne for himself. Henry had to buy the loyalty of his new subjects, and he had to buy it fast. On the day of his coronation, Henry issued a remarkable document, a Charter of Liberties. In it, he officially condemned the oppressive, greedy policies of his dead brother. He promised good governance. He promised to respect the church. He promised to be a just ruler. It was a brilliant piece of political theatre. He gave the powerful barons what they wanted to hear. He secured his base, and when his brother Robert finally invaded a year later, Henry was ready. The two brothers met, negotiated, and backed down. For a brief moment, Henry agreed to pay Robert an annuity of £2,000 a year to keep the peace. But Henry was not a man who liked sharing power or paying off his rivals. He waited. He built his strength. He systematically dismantled the power bases of the noblemen who had supported his brother. And then he crossed the English Channel. In the year 1106, at the Battle of Tinchebray, Henry crushed his older brother's army. Robert was captured. Henry locked him in a royal prison, where the former Duke of Normandy would spend the next 28 years, completely erased from the world, until the day he died. Henry had done it. He had reunited his father's empire. He was the undisputed master of England and Normandy, and for the next few decades, Henry I proved to be an administrative genius. He spent more than half his time in France, defending his borders. But because he was constantly on the move, he needed a system to keep England running while he was away. He didn't just rule by the sword, he ruled by the ledger. He expanded the royal bureaucracy. He created a permanent committee of administrators who met twice a year to audit the accounts of the kingdom's sheriffs. They sat around a large table covered in a checkered cloth. They moved wooden counters across the squares, calculating the wealth of the kingdom like a massive high-stakes game of chess. This was the birth of the Exchequer, the financial heartbeat of the English government. Henry manipulated the system perfectly. He used the law to extract fines. He sold offices, wardships, and marriages to the highest bidder. If a wealthy baron died, Henry charged his heir a fortune just to inherit his own land. He kept the powerful men of his kingdom in a state of semi-permanent debt. It was a brilliant, quiet form of control. If you owed the king money, you obeyed the king's commands. He was rich, he was feared, he was secure. He had successfully managed the chaotic, violent kingdom he had stolen in the wake of a hunting accident. And most importantly, he had a son. His name was William. He was Henry's only legitimate male heir, the golden boy who would inherit the vast, stable empire his father and grandfather had built. In the winter of the year 1120, Henry's court was preparing to sail from Normandy back to England. It was a cold, dark evening in late November. The king sailed ahead on his own royal vessel, leaving his young son, William, to follow on a magnificent, state-of-the-art ship called the White Ship. Prince William was young, arrogant, and ready to celebrate. He brought aboard a massive entourage of the youngest, wealthiest, and most powerful nobles of the next generation. They were the future of the Anglo-Norman Empire. Before the ship set sail, the prince ordered wine to be brought aboard. Casks upon casks of it. The crew drank, the nobles drank. The atmosphere was a chaotic, loud, drunken party. When they finally pushed away from the docks in the pitch black of the winter night, the drunken crew tried to row as fast as humanly possible, hoping to catch up with the king's ship ahead. They were reckless. They were blind in the dark. Just outside the harbour, the White Ship slammed violently into a jagged rock hidden just below the surface of the freezing water. The hull shattered. The freezing seawater rushed in. Panic consumed the darkness. The screams of the wealthiest young men and women in the empire echoed across the icy waves. Prince William managed to get into a small lifeboat. He could have escaped. He could have survived. But as he rowed away into the dark, he heard his half-sister screaming for him from the sinking wreckage. He ordered his men to row back to save her. It was a fatal mistake of nobility. As the small wooden lifeboat approached the sinking White Ship, dozens of freezing, desperate, drowning nobles threw themselves at it. The sheer weight of their panic capsized the small boat. Prince William vanished beneath the freezing black waves. Almost 300 people drowned that night. The flower of the Anglo-Norman nobility was wiped out in a single drunken hour. Only one man survived to tell the tale. A poor butcher, who clung to the broken mast through the freezing night, kept warm only by the thick sheepskin coats he was wearing. When the news reached England, no one dared to tell the king. Finally, a young boy was sent to fall at Henry's feet, weeping, whispering the truth. Chroniclers wrote that when King Henry heard the news, he collapsed to the floor in a dead faint, and it was said that for the rest of his life, the King of England never smiled again. The White Ship disaster wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political apocalypse. In a single night, the carefully constructed future of the empire was dragged to the bottom of the sea. Henry tried desperately to fix it. Less than 3 months later, he married a new young wife, praying for another son. But the marriage produced no children. As he grew older, surrounded by his wealth and his brilliant bureaucracy, Henry was consumed by anxiety. He forced his barons to swear oaths of loyalty to his only surviving legitimate child, his daughter Matilda. He married her to a powerful foreign lord, Geoffrey of Anjou, hoping their combined strength would secure the throne. But a woman had never ruled England, and the proud Norman barons despised her new husband. When King Henry finally died in the year 1135, all his meticulous planning, all his ruthless control, all the silver counted on the checkered cloth of the Exchequer, none of it could stop what was coming. The crown was supposed to go to his daughter, but a kingdom built on violence is easily tempted by it. As the old king's body grew cold, a shadow fell over the realm. The long peace was over. The era of the sword was about to return, and England was about to descend into a darkness so profound, people would say that Christ and his saints had fallen asleep. When Henry I took his final agonizing breath in December of the year 1135, the elaborate succession plan he had spent a lifetime building vanished like breath on a cold mirror. His chosen heir, his daughter Matilda, was far away in Anjou with her husband. But power abhors a vacuum, and the English throne was the ultimate prize. Enter Stephen of Blois. He was the old king's nephew, and unlike Matilda, he was not trapped deep in the French countryside. He was in Boulogne, just a single day's hard ride and a short sail across the English Channel. Geography is often destiny, and in this moment, geography handed Stephen an empire. Before the news of the king's death had even fully spread, Stephen was moving. He crossed the winter sea. He rode hard for London. The citizens of London, wealthy and pragmatic, welcomed him. They needed a strong man to keep the trade routes open and the peace secured, not a distant queen. From London, Stephen immediately galloped to Winchester. Winchester was the key. It was where the royal treasury was kept, vaults, filled with mountains of silver coins, jewels, and the financial lifeblood of the Anglo-Norman state. Stephen's own brother, Henry of Blois, was the Bishop of Winchester. With a turn of a heavy iron key, the wealth of a nation was handed over to a usurper. The only thing left was the crown itself. Stephen convinced the Archbishop of Canterbury to anoint him. He argued, smoothly and persuasively, that the oaths the barons had sworn to Matilda years ago had been forced upon them under the threat of violence. And an oath made in fear, he claimed, was no oath at all. On the 22nd of December, just weeks after the old king died, Stephen sat in Westminster Abbey and felt the heavy gold crown placed upon his head. It was a bloodless, brilliant coup. For the barons who owned massive estates on both sides of the English Channel, Stephen's swift victory was a massive relief. If they supported Matilda, they risked losing their English lands. If they supported Stephen, they kept everything. Greed and self-preservation won out. They bent the knee to King Stephen. For the first 2.5 years, the realm was eerily quiet. It seemed the trauma of succession had been avoided, but below the surface, the earth was cracking. Stephen was a brave knight, a handsome man, and by all accounts, a genuinely charming individual. But charm does not rule an empire. He lacked the ruthless, cold-blooded calculation of his uncle and grandfather. He could not inspire the absolute, paralyzing fear that kept medieval barons in line, and a medieval king who cannot inspire fear is a king who is bleeding in the water. The first scent of blood came in the summer of the year, 1138. Robert of Gloucester, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, and Matilda's half-brother, officially renounced his loyalty to Stephen. He declared for his sister. It was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The Anglo-Norman Empire fractured. Stephen, sensing the slipping control, began to panic. He made catastrophic political mistakes. He grew suspicious of his own government. He arrested 3 immensely powerful bishops, including the very men who ran the royal administration. In doing so, he alienated the church, the most powerful institution in the medieval world. Then, in the autumn of the year, 1139, the nightmare arrived on English shores. Matilda landed at Arundel, in the south of England. Stephen had her trapped. He could have ended the war right there. He could have besieged the castle, starved her out, thrown her in a dark cell, and secured his bloodline forever. But Stephen was a creature of chivalry. He believed in the romantic codes of knightly honour. Instead of crushing his rival, he granted her safe passage. He actually allowed Matilda to travel safely across the country to Bristol, so she could join forces with her brother Robert. It was a gesture of breathtaking nobility, and it was the single most foolish decision of his life. Because of that moment of chivalry, England was plunged into a nightmare that would last for 19 agonising years. A period of history so dark, so violent, and so devoid of law that an Anglo-Saxon chronicler famously wrote, "It was a time when Christ and his saints slept." This was the Anarchy. It wasn't a war of glorious, sweeping cavalry charges across open fields. It was a grinding, brutal war of attrition. It was a war of castles. Local barons, realising the king was too weak to stop them, began building their own illegal fortified stone towers all over the countryside. From these castles they ruled like petty tyrants. They tortured peasants for hidden silver. They burned neighbouring villages. They stole livestock. They destroyed crops. The royal justice system collapsed. There was no law but the sword. If you were a farmer, you lived in constant, terrifying anticipation of armed men riding over the horizon to take everything you had. England was bleeding to death. In February of the year 1141, the two sides finally clashed in a major confrontation at the Battle of Lincoln. Stephen fought like a demon. When his sword shattered on the armour of his enemies, he drew a massive battle axe and swung it until it too broke in his hands. He fought until he was surrounded, exhausted, and beaten to the ground. King Stephen was captured. He was dragged away in chains and locked in the dungeons of Bristol Castle. Matilda had won. The crown was hers. That summer, she marched triumphantly into London to prepare for her coronation. She called herself the Lady of the English. But Matilda suffered from a fatal flaw. She was impossibly arrogant. She demanded heavy taxes from the citizens of London. When they asked her for mercy, she insulted them. She treated the people who had opened their gates to her like conquered slaves. The Londoners were not peasants. They were wealthy, proud, and heavily armed. The church bells of London began to ring, not in celebration, but in warning. It was the signal for a civilian uprising. A massive, furious mob poured out of the streets and swarmed toward Matilda's quarters. They drove the would-be queen out of the city. She had to flee on horseback, leaving her unfinished coronation feast rotting on the tables. Matilda never wore the crown. She had grasped the ultimate prize, and her own pride had forced her to drop it. The chaos deepened. Months later, Stephen's loyalists managed to capture Matilda's most crucial commander, her brother, Robert of Gloucester. The two sides were deadlocked. They had no choice but to make a prisoner exchange. King Stephen was released from his dark cell. Robert was handed back to Matilda. The board was reset. The slaughter continued. For over a decade, England burned. The barons switched sides whenever it suited them, squeezing the land dry. Matilda eventually lost hope. Exhausted and defeated by the endless stalemate, she left England in the year 1148, never to return. But she left behind a son, Henry Plantagenet. Henry was young, brilliant, and terrifyingly ambitious. While England tore itself apart, he had been building a massive power base in France. By the year 1153, Henry landed in England, ready to take back his mother's stolen crown. He brought an army, but more importantly, he brought the promise of an end. The barons of England were exhausted. Their lands were ruined. Their wealth was depleted. They had no appetite for another 20 years of war. They simply wanted peace. When Stephen's own son and heir, Eustace, suddenly died of a sudden illness in August of that year, the fight went out of the old king. Stephen was tired. He had fought for nearly 2 decades for a crown that had brought him nothing but pain. The two sides met. They negotiated the Treaty of Westminster. The terms were a bitter compromise. Stephen would remain King of England for the rest of his natural life. But upon his death, the crown would pass not to his remaining children, but to his rival, young Henry. Stephen, the charming, chivalrous usurper, ruled unopposed for only a few more months. In October of the year 1154, his heart finally gave out. He died a broken, exhausted man, and was buried beside his wife and son in the quiet dark of a monastic tomb. The anarchy was over. The long nightmare had ended. But the young man waiting to take the throne was about to build an empire that would make the world tremble. An empire of law, of fire, and of absolute, unforgiving power. The ashes of the 19-year civil war were still smouldering when a new shadow fell across the English Channel. It was October. In the year 1154, Stephen was dead, and a young man, only 21 years old, stepped onto the shores of England to claim his prize. His name was Henry Plantagenet, Henry II. If you picture a medieval king of England, you probably imagine a man sitting on a throne in London, speaking English, worrying about English weather and English harvests. Forget that image completely. Henry was not just the King of England. He was the CEO of a massive multinational corporation of power, a medieval superpower that historians now call the Angevin Empire. His territory stretched all the way from the freezing borders of Scotland down to the sun-baked Pyrenees Mountains in southern France. He was arguably the most powerful ruler in Europe. He was wealthier than the Holy Roman Emperor, and he completely eclipsed the King of France, who was technically supposed to be his feudal lord. But here is the most fascinating part. To Henry, England was almost a side project, a rainy, backward province that provided him with massive royal wealth and a very prestigious title. The true beating heart of his empire was not on the Thames. It was in the lush river valleys of France. Henry was the Count of Anjou and the Duke of Normandy. And just 2 years before he took the English throne, he pulled off the greatest political marriage of the century. Eleanor of Aquitaine was the most eligible, powerful, and fiercely independent woman in Europe. She had just divorced King Louis VII of France. Exactly 8 weeks later, she married young Henry. With that single marriage, Henry swallowed the vast, impossibly rich lands of Aquitaine. He now controlled the massive medieval trades of wine and salt. The silver flowed into his coffers like a river. Henry was a force of nature. He was a man of terrifying energy. He almost never sat down. He was always on horseback, constantly riding from one corner of his massive empire to the other. His court, his bureaucrats, his exhausted servants, and his scribes had to desperately chase after him through the mud and the snow. He moved so fast that his enemies truly believed he was using dark magic. He seemed to be everywhere at once. And in England, his first job was to clean up the catastrophic mess left by the Anarchy. He tore down the illegal castles. He restored the royal courts. He brought the arrogant barons back to their knees. But absolute power requires absolute control, and there was one institution in Henry's vast empire that still refused to bow to him: the Church. The Church had its own courts, its own laws, and its own wealth. If a priest committed a murder, he was not tried by the king's judges. He was tried by the Church, and often he escaped the hangman's noose. Henry hated this. He wanted a single, unified system of justice under the crown. He wanted control. So, in the year 1162, Henry made a brilliant, cynical move, or so he thought. The position of Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest spiritual authority in England, was empty. Henry appointed his own chancellor, his best friend, his drinking companion, and closest advisor, a man named Thomas Becket. The king's logic was simple: put your best friend in charge of the church, and the church becomes yours. But the moment the heavy holy robes were placed on Thomas Becket's shoulders, a chilling transformation occurred. Becket did not become the king's puppet. He resigned as chancellor. He stopped wearing silk and started wearing a scratching, painful hair shirt beneath his clothes. He became a religious fanatic, a fierce, uncompromising defender of the church's independence. Henry felt utterly betrayed. The friendship turned into a bitter, venomous hatred. In the year 1164, Henry summoned his bishops to Clarendon and issued a stark declaration of royal supremacy. He demanded that criminous clerics be stripped of their protections and handed over to the state for punishment. Becket fought him. Then he yielded under extreme pressure. Then, horrified by his own weakness, he retracted his submission. Henry was furious. He decided to destroy Becket. He summoned him to court on fabricated charges of financial corruption, aiming to strip him of everything he owned. Driven to desperation, Becket fled across the English Channel in the dead of night, seeking refuge with the Pope and the French king. For 6 long years, the Archbishop lived in exile. The Church in England was left in a state of chaotic suspension. During those years, Henry didn't sit around mourning his lost friend. He expanded his empire. He conquered Brittany. He reformed the English legal system, laying the early groundwork for what we now call the common law. But the Becket problem was a rotting wound. Finally, in the year 1170, a fragile, tense truce was brokered. Thomas Becket returned to England, but Becket had not returned to make peace. He had returned to seek vengeance. Immediately upon stepping onto English soil, he excommunicated the bishops who had supported Henry during his exile. He cut them off from God. When the news of this aggressive act reached King Henry, who was holding court in France, he flew into a legendary, blinding rage. He screamed at his courtiers. He cursed the men who ate his bread but refused to protect him from this one arrogant priest. History records his frantic outburst as, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights in his court heard the king's desperate, violent plea. They did not ask for clarification. They saw an opportunity to win the ultimate royal favour. They slipped away, crossed the winter sea, and rode hard for Canterbury. It was the 29th of December, 4 days after Christmas, the year 1170. The monks were singing the evening prayers in the freezing, candlelit cathedral. The heavy wooden doors burst open. The 4 knights stomped into the sacred space, their heavy armour clanking against the stone, their swords drawn. They demanded Becket submit to the king. Becket refused. He stood his ground in the dim light of the holy altar. The knights hacked him down. Right there, on the consecrated floor of the cathedral, they sliced the crown of his head clean off. His blood and brains spilled across the cold ancient stones. The murder sent a shockwave of pure horror across the entire Christian world. It was an atrocity. The highest holy man in the land, butchered in his own sanctuary. In record time, the Pope declared Becket a saint. Miracles were reported at his tomb. Henry was instantly cast as the villain of Europe. He was forced to walk barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and allow the monks to whip his bear back in penance. You might think this would be the end of Henry II, that the public outrage would shatter his empire, but history is rarely that simple. Once the storm of public protest faded, the reality remained. Henry's grip on his vast empire was absolute. He had removed his greatest domestic rival, and ironically, His power peaked in the early years of the 1170s. He was invincible. No foreign army could break him. No church decree could topple him. The only thing that could destroy the great Henry II was his own blood. Henry and Eleanor had 4 surviving sons: young Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. This family was so notoriously dysfunctional, so fiercely competitive and aggressive, that they were openly referred to as the Devil's Brood. Legend said they were descended from a demon, and they certainly acted like it. Henry had planned to divide his massive empire among his sons after his death, but there was a problem. Henry loved power too much to let it go while he was still breathing. He gave his sons grand titles, but he gave them no real money and no actual authority. He treated them like children, and they were not children. They were young, heavily armed warlords. Starting in the year 1173, Henry's life became a permanent nightmare of family betrayal. His sons rebelled against him. Time and time again, they raised armies, they burned his lands, and the deepest cut of all? Their rebellions were actively supported and funded by their mother, his own wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry actually had to place his wife under house arrest for 16 years to stop her from destroying him. Whenever the sons needed a safe haven or extra gold, they simply rode to the court of the French king, first Louis VII, and later his son, the cold, calculating Philip Augustus. Philip Augustus was a political sniper. He spent his entire life patiently, methodically picking apart the Angevin Empire by turning Henry's sons against their father. It was a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. By the year 1189, the great king was worn out. His eldest son was dead. Geoffrey was dead. His favourite son, the one he had always secretly preferred, was John. But his most dangerous son, Richard the man who would soon be known as the Lionheart, was now actively hunting him down, allied with the French king. Cornered, sick, and physically exhausted from 34 years of endless riding and endless fighting, Henry II was forced to surrender. He agreed to humiliating terms, but the final crushing blow came when he asked to see the list of the barons who had secretly joined Richard's rebellion against him. At the very top of the list, written in clear ink, was the name of his beloved youngest son, John. It broke his spirit entirely. He turned his face to the wall. He was heard whispering, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." On the 6th of July, 1189, in the castle of Chinon, the man who had built the greatest empire in Europe died feeling like an utter failure. He had spent his life trying to manage the elite, trying to control the uncontrollable. He gave England a system of common law that would eventually echo across the globe and last for centuries. But to Henry, all of that was just paperwork. What mattered to a medieval king was family, legacy, and land. And in his dying eyes, his family was a curse, his legacy was fractured, and his land was burning. Now, the empire belonged to Richard. The Lionheart was about to take the throne, and he had his eyes set on a prize much farther away than the rainy shores of England. When you think of a medieval king, there is usually one name that comes to mind before all others: Richard the Lionheart. He is the legend, the golden warrior, the Crusader king with a sword in his hand and a cross on his chest. In the popular imagination, he is the ultimate English hero. But history is rarely a fairy tale, and the reality of Richard I is far more complicated and far darker than the myths. Richard was born in England, but he did not care about England. He did not speak English. He was the Duke of Aquitaine, raised in the sun-drenched vineyards and poetic courts of southern France. When his exhausted, broken father died in 1189, Richard took the English crown, but he did not stay to wear it. Out of his entire 10-year reign, King Richard spent barely 6 months on English soil. To him, England was not a homeland. It was a bank. It was a cold, rainy island filled with taxable peasants, silver and sheep. Richard had a singular, burning obsession. He wanted to march to the Holy Land. He wanted to face the great Muslim leader Saladin. He wanted to retake Jerusalem, and crusades are violently expensive. Before he left, Richard bled his kingdom dry. He sold everything. He sold titles. He sold lands. He sold castles. He even joked that he would sell the city of London itself if he could find a buyer rich enough. In the summer of 1190 he sailed away, leaving the administration of his kingdom in the hands of his royal clerks and his ambitious, untrustworthy younger brother John. For years, England waited. The people paid their heavy taxes and prayed for their warrior king. Richard achieved terrifying victories in the east. He fought with a brutal, almost superhuman ferocity, but he never took Jerusalem. Exhausted and feverish, he signed a truce with Saladin and began the long journey home. But the lion did not return in triumph. While travelling in disguise through Europe, Richard was recognised, captured, and thrown into a dark cell in the Holy Roman Empire. The greatest warrior in Christendom was a hostage. When the ransom demand finally reached England, it sent a shockwave of sheer panic through the government. The emperor demanded an astronomical sum, 100,000 marks of pure silver. It was a number so massive, so incomprehensible, that it amounted to roughly 3 times the annual income of the entire English crown. If you were a farmer, a merchant, or a baron in England during those years, your life became an endless cycle of extortion. The royal tax collectors knocked on every door. They took a quarter of every man's income. They took the silver chalices from the church altars. They sheared the sheep and took the profits. England was squeezed until it bruised, but they paid it. In 1194, the Lionheart was released. He briefly returned to England, just long enough to put down a small rebellion led by his brother John, and to raise more money. Then, he crossed the sea back to France. He would never see England again. For the next 5 years, Richard waged a brilliant, ruthless war to reclaim the lands his brother had lost to the French king, Philip Augustus. He was invincible in battle, but he was not immortal. In April of 1199, Richard was besieging a tiny, insignificant castle in France. He was walking the perimeter, not wearing his chainmail armour. A lone crossbowman stood on the castle walls. He took aim. The bolt struck the Lionheart in the shoulder. It was a minor wound, but the medical care of the Middle Ages was a gamble with death. The wound turned black. Gangrene set in. A few days later, the Golden King of England died in agony, killed by an anonymous archer at a forgotten fortress. The empire was suddenly left without its shield, and the crown passed to the last remaining son of the devil's brood, John. History has not been kind to King John, and for good reason. He was not a warrior like Richard. He was not a strategic genius like his father Henry. John was deeply paranoid. He trusted no one, and in return, no one trusted him. He had a cruel streak that bordered on the sadistic. When John took the throne, the Angevin Empire was already cracking under the immense pressure of French ambition. Philip Augustus, the cold and calculating king of France, smelled blood. He knew John was weak. He knew John was disliked by his own barons. The first crisis came from within the family. John's teenage nephew, Arthur, claimed the throne. In 1202, John actually managed a rare military victory. He captured Arthur and locked him in a dungeon. But then, Arthur simply vanished. Dark rumours flooded the courts of Europe. It was whispered that John, in a drunken rage, had murdered his own teenage nephew with his bare hands and dumped the body into the river. Whether it was true or not, the damage was permanent. John was branded a monster. The powerful barons of France abandoned him in disgust. Philip Augustus struck. In 1204, the unthinkable happened. The massive, impregnable fortress of Château Gaillard fell to the French, and with it, Normandy fell. The ancestral homeland, the land of William the Conqueror, the jewel of the empire, it was gone. John had lost it all. He fled across the sea to England. His enemies gave him a new, humiliating nickname. He was no longer just John Lackland. They called him Softsword. For the rest of his miserable reign, John would be trapped on the island of England, and because he was trapped, his English subjects felt the full, suffocating weight of his presence. He needed money to win back his lost empire. Huge, impossible amounts of money. He squeezed the barons harder than any king before him. If a noble displeased him, John didn't just fine him. He demanded hostages. He locked up the wives and children of his own lords just to ensure their loyalty. But John didn't just fight with his nobles, he picked a fight with God. In 1205, John got into a bitter dispute with Pope Innocent III over who should be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope was not a man to be crossed. He was the ultimate spiritual authority on earth. When John refused to back down, the Pope unleashed a weapon of mass spiritual destruction. In 1208, he placed England under an interdict. Imagine what this meant in the medieval world. To these people, the church was not just a building, it was the only gate to heaven. And suddenly, the gate was slammed shut. The church doors were locked, the bells stopped ringing. You could not be married in a church. You could not receive communion. Most terrifying of all, the dead could no longer be buried in consecrated ground. Families were forced to bury their loved ones in the woods or in muddy ditches, terrified that their souls were doomed to purgatory. For 6 long years, the silence of the churches hung over England like a shroud. You might think this would break King John. It didn't. He actually loved it. Because the church was officially on strike, John simply confiscated all the massive, untaxed wealth of the bishoprics and monasteries. The Interdict made him richer than ever, but a king cannot rule by fear and stolen silver forever. In 1212, John realized a terrifying truth. He was surrounded by traitors. His barons were plotting to kill him, and the French king was preparing an invasion fleet, blessed by the Pope. Cornered and desperate, John folded. He submitted completely to the Pope. He actually surrendered the entire Kingdom of England to the papacy and received it back as a feudal vassal. He bought the Pope's protection, but his domestic problems were boiling over. John took his massive hoard of silver and launched one final, desperate military campaign to retake his lands in France. It all came down to a single, chaotic day in July of 1214, the Battle of Bouvines. John's allies were utterly crushed by the French army. His grand strategy was ruined. The money was gone. The empire was permanently lost. When John returned to England in the winter of 1214, he was a beaten, broke, and humiliated man, and the barons of England were waiting for him. They had reached their breaking point. For 15 years, they had suffered extortion, hostage-taking, and the loss of their French estates. They armed themselves. They marched on London. The city opened its gates to the rebels. John was trapped. He had no army. He had no money. In June of 1215, the two sides met in a damp, marshy meadow outside of London, a place called Runnymede. There, surrounded by furious, heavily armed warlords, King John was forced to press his royal seal onto a piece of parchment. We call it the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Today, we revere it as the foundation of modern liberty and democracy. But in 1215, no one was thinking about democracy. The barons didn't care about the rights of the poor peasants freezing in the mud. They cared about their own wealth, their own power. The Magna Carta was a desperate peace treaty. It was a list of rules designed to chain a tyrant. It stated, for the first time in history, that the king was not above the law, that he could not simply take property or life without a fair trial. John agreed to the terms because he had a sword to his throat. But the moment he rode away from Runnymede, he sent a secret message to the Pope, asking him to annul the document. The Pope agreed. The peace treaty lasted barely 10 weeks. Civil war exploded across England. The barons, realizing John would never change, did the unthinkable. They invited a foreign prince, Louis of France, to come and take the English throne. A French army landed on the beaches. They marched into London. The Angevin Empire was collapsing in real time. John spent the last months of his life running. He marched his mercenary army back and forth across the country, burning villages and hiding from his enemies. In October of 1216, he attempted to cross the treacherous tidal quicksands of an area known as the Wash. He misjudged the tide. The dark, freezing water rushed in. John made it across, but his massive baggage train, containing his treasury, his jewels, and perhaps even the crown of England itself, was swallowed by the mud and the sea. A few days later, stricken by dysentery and exhausted by a lifetime of paranoia and failure, King John died in the middle of a raging storm. He left behind a kingdom torn in half, a foreign prince occupying his capital, and a 9-year-old son sitting on a fragile, trembling throne. The era of the warlords was over. The era of the politicians was about to begin. When King John died in the howling storm of 1216, he left his country in absolute, shattered ruin. Half of England was occupied by a French prince. The barons were in open rebellion. The treasury was sitting at the bottom of the sea. And the new King of England was a 9-year-old boy. His name was Henry III. By all the rules of medieval politics, this boy should not have survived. He should have been quietly smothered in his sleep, or locked in a tower and forgotten. But a strange thing happens when a kingdom reaches the absolute bottom of the abyss. People pull back. The great warlords, exhausted by the bloodshed and terrified of French domination, rallied around the boy king. They drove the French out. They reissued the Magna Carta, turning it from a failed peace treaty into the actual law of the land. They saved the crown, but as the boy king grew into a man, it became painfully clear that surviving a crisis is not the same as knowing how to rule. Henry III was on the throne for 56 years. It is one of the longest reigns in English history. He was not a cruel man like his father John. He was deeply pious. He was a devoted husband. He spent vast fortunes rebuilding Westminster Abbey into a soaring, breathtaking masterpiece of Gothic architecture. He was an artist at heart, but as a politician, he was a walking disaster. Henry was obsessed with reclaiming the lost French Empire of his ancestors. He launched military campaigns into France, and they ended in embarrassing failures. In 1259, he was finally forced to sign the Treaty of Paris, officially surrendering the dream of Normandy, Anjou, and Poitou forever. England was no longer just a province of a French empire. The island was now the undisputed centre of the Plantagenet world. But Henry didn't seem to understand his own kingdom. He surrounded himself with foreigners. He showered his wife's French relatives and his own half-brothers from the continent with massive estates and royal titles. The English barons, who were developing a new, fierce sense of national identity, watched this with growing, bitter anger. And then, Henry made the most foolish financial decision of his life. The Pope offered him a prize, the Kingdom of Sicily, far away in the sunny Mediterranean. It was for Henry's younger son, Edmund. There was just one catch. Sicily was currently occupied by a powerful enemy army. Henry would have to pay the Pope to conquer it. Henry agreed. He promised the Pope the astronomical sum of 135,000 marks. He didn't have the money. He couldn't even raise a fraction of it. When the barons found out about this absurd, bankrupting promise, they simply snapped. In the spring of 1258, a group of the most powerful men in England marched into the King's Hall. They were fully armed. They didn't ask for favours. They demanded a revolution. They forced Henry to accept a radical new system of government, outlined in documents called the Provisions of Oxford and later the Provisions of Westminster. This was not just another Magna Carta. This was a hostile takeover. The barons stripped the adult king of his power. They placed the government in the hands of a ruling council. They effectively turned the King of England into a figurehead. And the man who emerged as the leader of this revolution was, ironically, a foreigner himself. His name was Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester. He was also the king's own brother-in-law. Simon de Montfort is one of the most fascinating, contradictory figures in history. He was a religious zealot. He was fiercely arrogant, but he possessed a brilliant, terrifying charisma. He claimed to act not for himself, but for the community of the realm. For a few tense years, England balanced on the edge of a knife. Henry tried to break free of his chains. Simon tightened them. In 1264, the tension finally snapped into open warfare. At the Battle of Lewes, Simon de Montfort's rebel army completely crushed the royalist forces. King Henry was captured, but more importantly, his eldest son, Prince Edward, was also taken prisoner. Simon de Montfort was now the uncrowned master of England. He summoned parliaments. He effectively ruled the country in the king's name. But holding on to supreme power is like holding a starving wolf by the ears. Eventually, your grip slips. In the summer of 1265, Prince Edward managed to escape his guards. Edward was not like his father. He was tall, athletic, fiercely intelligent, and utterly ruthless. He rallied the royalist barons, he raised an army, and he hunted Simon de Montfort down. They met at the Battle of Evesham in August. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. A massive, violent thunderstorm broke over the field just as the fighting began. The sky turned black. Lightning shattered the gloom. Simon was hopelessly outnumbered. When he saw Edward's army marching toward him with perfect, terrifying discipline, he famously muttered, "May God have mercy on our souls, for our bodies are theirs." Edward's men did not just kill Simon de Montfort, they tore him apart. His body was hacked to pieces in the mud. His head, hands and feet were chopped off. His mutilated remains were scattered. It was a brutal, graphic warning to anyone who would ever dare to challenge the royal bloodline again. Royal authority was restored. King Henry lived out his final years in the quiet, peaceful shadow of his terrifying, capable son. When Henry died in 1272, Prince Edward was far away, fighting in the Crusades. When he heard the news, he did not rush back in a panic like the kings before him. He knew his throne was absolutely secure. He took his time, travelling slowly through Europe, arriving in England 2 years later. Edward I had returned. History knows him by many names: the lawgiver, Longshanks, the hammer. He was a man who believed in order, in structure, and in the absolute, unquestionable dominance of the English crown. He looked at his kingdom, and his eyes settled on the jagged, mountainous horizon to the west. Wales. For 2 centuries, the Anglo-Norman kings had claimed a vague overlordship over Wales, but the reality was very different. Wales was a fractured land of deep valleys, fierce weather, and fiercely independent princes. The Norman barons had carved out private empires along the borders, known as the Welsh Marches, but the deep mountains of the north and west remained untamed. In 1267, the powerful Welsh leader, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, had actually forced Henry III to officially recognise him as the Prince of Wales. But Edward was not his father. He had no intention of sharing power on his island. When Llywelyn refused to pay homage to the new English king, Edward did not just send a diplomatic protest. He sent an army. In 1277, Edward invaded. He used a massive military force to humiliate Llywelyn, stripping him of most of his lands. But the Welsh pride was unbroken. 5 years later, in 1282, Llywelyn and his brother Dafydd rose in a massive, desperate rebellion. This time, Edward did not fight to negotiate. He fought to annihilate. He brought the full, crushing financial and military weight of the English state crashing down on the Welsh mountains. He mobilised thousands of foot soldiers, heavy cavalry, and a massive supply fleet. In a tragic, anticlimactic skirmish near a bridge, Llywelyn was ambushed and killed. His head was cut off and sent to London, where it was placed on a spike at the tower, crowned in mocking ivy. His brother, Dafydd, was hunted down, captured, and dragged before Edward. Edward decided to make an example of him. A terrifying, unprecedented example. Dafydd was tried for treason. He was the first prominent nobleman in over 200 years to suffer the ultimate, gruesome punishment for rebellion. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. The native Welsh dynasty was dead. Edward officially annexed Wales in 1284. He introduced English common law to the conquered lands. But he knew that laws written on parchment cannot hold a hostile, mountainous country. Only stone can do that. Edward began the most massive, expensive, and intimidating military construction project in medieval European history. He built the Iron Ring, a chain of massive, state-of-the-art castles wrapped around the coastline and the mountains of North Wales. Flint, Rhuddlan, Conway, Harlech, Beaumaris, and the dark, imperial masterpiece, Caernarfon. These were not just forts. They were psychological weapons on a gargantuan scale. Imagine being a Welsh farmer. Your prince is dead, your laws are gone, and rising from the shores of your ancient homeland are these monstrous alien structures, walls of perfectly cut stone, 10 feet thick, soaring towers that blot out the sun. They cost an absolute fortune. Edward poured unimaginable amounts of silver into these stones, draining the royal treasury. But they worked. The castles were impregnable. They required tiny garrisons to hold off massive armies. They were the ultimate expression of dominance. Edward I had hammered Wales into submission, and soon his cold, calculating eyes would turn north toward the peaceful, prosperous kingdom of Scotland. But while the king built his massive stone fortresses, and while the great lords played their bloody games of power and treason, what about the others? Play. What about the people who actually cut the stone, the people who paid the taxes, the people who grew the wheat to feed the armies? While the kings and barons wrote the headlines of history, a quiet, desperate crisis was brewing in the mud and the fields of England. A crisis of life, death, and sheer, overwhelming numbers. While the kings of the Angevins and the Plantagenets played their bloody games of thrones across the map of Europe, and while the great lords built their towering castles of stone, a completely different story was unfolding in the shadows. It is time to look away from the soaring towers of Caernarfon. It is time to look down into the mud. Look into the dark, smoky, windowless huts scattered across the English countryside. Because this is where the true history of the world is written. Not in the royal decrees, but in the calloused hands, the aching backs, and the silent, desperate struggles of the unseen multitudes. To understand the sheer scale of the crisis that was brewing in the 13th century, we have to go back for a moment, back to the year 1086, and the massive, terrifying survey known as the Domesday Book. When William the Conqueror's men rode across the land, counting every pig and every plough, they gave us a snapshot of the English people. At that time, the economy was almost entirely agricultural. Over 90% of the population lived in rural villages. They drew their daily bread and their daily ale directly from the dirt beneath their feet. The Domesday Book broke this population down into cold, bureaucratic categories. About 41% of the people were recorded as villeins. These were the upper tier of the peasantry. They were serfs, bound to the local lord, but they held a decent amount of land to farm for themselves. Another 32% were called boarders, or cotters. These people were at the bottom of the property ladder. They held almost no land. They lived in a tiny cottage, with perhaps a small garden, entirely dependent on working for others just to survive. Then there were the freemen, making up about 14%, and at the very bottom, completely stripped of all human rights, were the slaves, making up roughly 9% of the recorded population. This was the world of the 11th century, a harsh, sparse world of perhaps 1 or 2 million people, living in a vast landscape of deep forests and quiet valleys. But as the decades bled into centuries, a silent, unstoppable explosion occurred. By the late 13th century, the world had profoundly, irreversibly changed. The slaves of the 11th century had largely disappeared, transitioning into the ranks of the poor peasantry. But the most terrifying change was the sheer number of human beings. We don't have exact census data for the late 1200s, but the estimates from historians are staggering. The population had more than doubled. It may have tripled. There were now perhaps 5 to 7 million people crowded onto the island of England. You have to understand what this means in a medieval economy. This was not the Industrial Revolution. There were no massive factories, no artificial fertilizers, no global supply chains to bring cheap grain from across the ocean. The primary industry was still exactly what it had been 200 years earlier. The dirt. More people meant more mouths to feed. And to feed those mouths, the English people had to find more land. They embarked on what historians call a journey to the margin. They marched into the ancient dark woods and began hacking down the trees. They marched into the marshlands and began digging drainage ditches. They pushed the boundaries of the plough up into the rocky, freezing hillsides. They were desperate for space. But the land they were clearing was often the worst land available. The soil was thin, the yields were pathetic, and they had hit a terrifying technological ceiling. They tried to adapt. In the 13th century, many villages shifted from a 2-field system to a 3-field system. This meant that instead of leaving half their land empty every year to recover its nutrients, they only left 1/3 of it empty. It was a desperate attempt to grow more food, but it created a fatal ecological trap. To keep soil healthy, you need fertilizer. And in the Middle Ages, the only reliable fertilizer was animal manure. But keeping massive herds of cattle and sheep alive through the freezing English winters was incredibly expensive. Furthermore, by ploughing up the pasture land to grow more grain for the exploding human population, they had less grass for the animals. Fewer animals meant less manure. Less manure meant the soil grew exhausted. They were trapped in a vicious cycle. They were working harder, clearing more land, planting more seeds, but the earth was simply refusing to give them more food. Historians use a chilling phrase to describe the English economy of the 13th century. They call it expansion without development. The towns were growing. Markets were popping up everywhere. The massive merchant ships, the cogs, were sailing across the sea, exporting English wool to the wealthy weavers of Flanders. But this economic boom was a mirage. It did not benefit the unseen multitudes. Because there were so many people, the demand for food skyrocketed, and when demand outpaces supply, prices explode. Around the year 1200, England experienced massive, crushing inflation. The price of a loaf of bread, a sack of grain, a simple wooden tool, everything went up. But what about wages? Because the population had exploded, there was an ocean of desperate people looking for work. When labour is cheap and plentiful, wages do not rise. For the entire 13th century, the amount of silver a labourer was paid for a day's work remained stagnant. Prices were skyrocketing, but incomes were flat. Real wages, the actual purchasing power of the average person, plummeted. The people were getting poorer, they were getting hungrier. The records from the great estates of the 13th century reveal a heartbreaking reality. Because there were so many people, the average size of a peasant's landholding was shrinking. Fathers had to divide their tiny plots among too many sons. The safety margin was completely gone. Manorial records use a very polite, clinical phrase to describe the peasantry of this era. They say the peasants became sensitive to the harvest. Sensitive to the harvest. Let me translate that from academic terminology into the brutal reality of human suffering. It meant that if it rained too much in July, you died. It meant that if a late frost killed the winter wheat, you watched your children slowly starve to death in the dark of your hut before the spring arrived. Death was no longer an abstract concept. It was a mathematical certainty directly tied to the weather. We actually have the grim statistics to prove it. On the West Midlands estate of Halesowen, researchers have analysed the death rates of the local population. The data is horrifying. The poor tenants, the people holding tiny scraps of land, the descendants of the Domesday cotters died, on average, a full 10 years earlier than their wealthier peasant neighbours. 10 years of life, stolen by chronic malnutrition, stolen by the cold, stolen by the sheer, grinding exhaustion of working an empty field for a rich lord. And what about the completely landless? The people who didn't even have a garden? The economic surplus population? They barely appear in the records. They were ghosts. They wandered the roads, begging, looking for a day's work, dying quietly in the ditches when the winter storms rolled in. While the poor were starving, the legal system was tightening like a noose around their necks. Around the year 1200, the royal judges, the very men who were creating the brilliant common law of England, made a defining legal distinction. They divided the population into two categories, free and unfree. To have access to the king's courts, to have the protection of the royal law, you had to be a free man. But if you were a villain, if you were a serf tied to the land of a local lord, the judges declared you to be unfree. With a stroke of a quill, half the population of England was legally enslaved to the dirt. If you were a serf, you could not leave your village without your lord's permission. You could not marry off your daughter without paying the lord a fine. If you managed to save a few silver pennies, the lord could theoretically take them, because a serf owned nothing. Even the serf's own body belonged to the lord. The law protected the status quo. It protected the wealthy, and the wealthy were having a magnificent century. Remember the massive inflation, the skyrocketing price of food? If you were a poor labourer, inflation meant starvation. But if you were a wealthy lord, an abbot of a massive monastery, or an earl with thousands of acres of land, inflation was a gold mine. In the 12th century, many lords had simply rented their lands out to tenants for a fixed annual fee. It was easy, low-maintenance income. But as the price of grain exploded, those fixed rents became worthless. The lords realised they were losing money. So, they ruthlessly adapted. They refused to renew leases. They evicted tenants. They took the land back under their direct, personal control. They became aggressive, profit-driven agricultural capitalists. The medieval lord of the 13th century was not just a knight in shining armour, he was a corporate executive. He hired professional managers, bailiffs, reeves. He hired roaming teams of ruthless auditors who travelled from manor to manor, checking every single ledger, counting every single sheaf of wheat, and ensuring that the maximum possible profit was being squeezed out of the earth and the peasants. They read new, popular textbooks on agricultural management, like the famous treatise written by Walter of Henley, which taught them exactly how to calculate the yield of a dairy cow and how to spot a cheating farmhand. The rich grew incredibly, obscenely rich. The Bishop of Ely saw his net income explode from roughly £900 in the 1270s to over £2,500 by the end of the century. They sold their massive surpluses of grain and wool on the open market at exorbitant prices, while the people who actually planted the seeds and sheared the sheep were literally starving to death outside the manor walls. The tension was unbearable. The records from the manor courts are filled with the quiet, desperate resistance of the poor. Peasants hiding grain, serfs refusing to perform their mandatory labour, entire villages pooling their meagre pennies to hire lawyers and fight their lords in court over ancient, forgotten customs. By the 1290s, England was a pressure cooker. It was desperately overcrowded. The soil was dying. The poor were trapped in a rigid legal cage, watching the rich feast on the profits of their starvation. The traditional economy could no longer cope with the sheer weight of human existence. The country was teetering on the absolute edge of a massive, violent class war. And as the new century approached, the fragile, deeply unequal system that had been built over 200 years was about to face a reckoning. But before the great famines and the plagues would arrive to sweep the board clean, we must look at how this machinery of extortion and control actually forged the very institutions that govern us today. Because out of this oppression, out of the king's desperate need for silver to fight his wars, something entirely unexpected was about to be born. As we reach the final chapter of our journey tonight, we must look away from the battlefields. We must step away from the soaring stone castles and the muddy, starving villages. We need to look at something much quieter, something that makes no sound at all, yet has shaped your life more profoundly than any sword ever forged. We need to look at a piece of parchment and a drop of hot wax. For 2 centuries, the kings of England had ruled from the saddle. They were roaming warlords, dragging their exhausted courts, their gold and their scribes through the rain and the mud from one side of their empire to the other. But as the empire grew more complicated, as the wars grew more expensive, the old ways began to break down. The king could no longer hold all the details of his realm in his head. He needed a machine. This machine did not have gears of iron or steam. It was made of ink, sheepskin, and the minds of meticulous, obsessive men. We saw its birth in the reign of Henry I. That large table covered in a checkered cloth, where men moved wooden counters to calculate the wealth of the kingdom. The Exchequer. But by the 13th century, this system had mutated into a massive, stationary bureaucracy. While the king continued to ride across the country, a permanent staff of accountants, lawyers, and clerks settled down in Westminster. They began to record everything. To understand how rapidly this machine grew, you only need to look at the royal sealing wax. In the late 1220s, the royal clerks used about 3 pounds of wax every week to seal official government letters. By the late 1260s, they were using over 31 pounds of wax every single week. They were generating a mountain of paperwork, millions of land charters, royal writs, and court records. And this paper obsession trickled down to the very bottom of society. Even the unfree serfs, the people who could not read a single word of Latin or French, suddenly realized they needed their own personal wax seals to participate in this new, terrifying legal world. Society was shifting from a world of human memory to a world of written record. And the primary reason for this explosion of paperwork was simple. The king needed money. The old Norman kings had lived off the massive profits of their own stolen lands. But by the 13th century, royal land was no longer enough. The cost of building massive stone castles in Wales, the cost of fighting the French king, the cost of sailing to the Crusades, it was bankrupting the crown. The kings realized they could not just rely on their own estates. They had to tap into the wealth of the entire nation. They began to tax. They didn't just tax the land anymore. They invented a new, terrifyingly efficient tax on everything a person owned. A tax on movables. On your sheep, your grain, your wooden carts. In the year 1207, King John levied a massive tax on movables that brought in over £60,000. It was a staggering, astronomical sum of silver. By the late 13th century, the crown had discovered another gold mine, wool. England was producing the finest wool in Europe. It was the oil of the medieval economy. In the year 1275, the government established a permanent export tax on every single sack of wool leaving the island. This tax alone brought in £8,000 to £13,000 a year, and managing all this international trade were the Italians, the invisible, immensely powerful bankers of the medieval world. Italian merchant companies had offices in London. They provided massive lines of credit to the English kings. King Edward I owed one Italian banking family nearly £400,000. They were the men pulling the financial strings behind the velvet curtains of the throne. But here is the great, defining twist of English history. You cannot simply demand a massive tax on the personal property of thousands of heavily armed, wealthy men without their permission. If you try, you get a civil war. You get the Magna Carta. The king had to ask. He had to convince them to open their purses. To do this, the king began calling his powerful barons and bishops to great councils. They would gather in a room, and the king's ministers would explain why they needed the money. A war in France, a crusade, a rebellion in Wales. They called these gatherings parliaments, from the French word meaning to talk. But the great barons were getting tired of approving these taxes on their own. They didn't want to bear the full burden of the king's wars, so they forced the king to cast a wider net. In the year 1290, King Edward called a parliament that lasted for 10 long weeks. For the first 2.5 months, the great lords debated and passed new laws, but when it came time to actually approve the massive new tax the king wanted, the lords refused to do it alone. In the middle of July, a new group of men arrived at Westminster. They were not dukes, they were not earls. They were ordinary knights, chosen from every single county in England. They were the wealthy, local landowners, the men who actually knew how much grain the villages produced. The king had to sit down and negotiate with them, because these knights represented the local communities. They represented the people who would actually have to pay the tax. This was the quiet, unglamorous birth of the House of Commons. The modern concept of representative government, the parliament, the congress, the democracy you live under today, was not born from a noble, philosophical desire for human equality. It was born from extortion. It was born because a desperate medieval king needed silver to pay for his wars, and he needed a bureaucratic mechanism to take that silver without starting a rebellion. History is a master of irony. The greed of the crown forged the chains that would eventually bind it. And as the political machine evolved, the legal machine evolved with it. For centuries, if you were accused of a terrible crime and there were no witnesses, the English courts used the ordeal. You would be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar, or you would be thrown into a pool of freezing water. It was a psychological lie detector. It relied on the absolute belief that God would physically intervene to protect the innocent. But in the 12th and 13th centuries, a new wave of rational thought swept across Europe. People began to doubt. They began to ask questions. And once you doubt the ordeal, its psychological power vanishes. In the year 1215, the Pope officially forbade priests from participating in the ordeal. It collapsed overnight. Suddenly, the English judges had a massive problem. How do you decide if a man is guilty of murder without asking God? They turned to the community. They gathered a group of local men who knew the neighbourhood, knew the rumours, and knew the people involved. They asked them to decide the truth. This was the birth of the trial by jury. And because jury trials were complicated, because they required sifting through evidence and arguing over the strict rules of the king's new common law, a brand new profession was born. The professional lawyer. The world was changing. The fog of the Dark Ages was lifting, revealing a society that looked surprisingly, uncomfortably familiar. A world of crushing taxation, of endless legal paperwork, of wealthy agricultural capitalists squeezing the poor, of parliaments debating government spending, and of powerful lawyers arguing in royal courts. It is time for us to step out of the shadows of the 13th century. When you close your eyes tonight, think about the incredible, chaotic journey we have taken. Think about the terrified Norman guards setting fire to the houses outside Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day. Think about the Red King bleeding to death in the silent woods. Think about the freezing, desperate screams of the young nobles as the white ship sank into the dark sea. Think about the blood of an archbishop pooling on the stone floor of a cathedral. Think about a tyrant forced to press his seal onto the Magna Carta in a muddy field. And think about the millions of unseen, unnamed people who lived and died in the dirt, their backs bent under the weight of an empire, paying the taxes that built the modern world. History is not a straight, rational line of progress. It is a chaotic, brutal web of fear, greed, accidental shipwrecks, and stray arrows. The laws you obey, the freedoms you enjoy, and the order of the society you live in, the underlying code of your reality was written with the blood and the contracts of these 3 violent centuries. Thank you for walking through the dark with me tonight. I hope you found some peace in the shadows of the past. Sleep well, and I will see you in the next chapter of human history.